Hello and welcome to Lecture 27 for History 362, African American History 1877 to the present. I'm going to be picking up the story of African American history from roughly the end of the Lyndon Johnson administration to the present. And of course I can't go into as much detail as I would like to, but I did want to try to put everything in context for you. Okay, well, one of the things that you may have heard about is that the two political parties shifted or switched places in the 1960s and the 1970s. And this all started with the choice of the Arizona senator and pretty conservative extremist presidential candidate Barry Goldwater, who was chosen to be the party's presidential candidate in 1964. He said extremism and the pursuit of justice is no vice, and there was a very famous political ad by the Democratic Party running against him that showed that he was such a fervent Cold Warrior that he was probably going to result in a nuclear apocalypse. This is the famous Daisy commercial. In any event, however, when Goldwater was chosen, this was a time period in which Southern Democrats were beginning to protest the Democratic Party's support of the 1957 and 1964 Civil Rights Act. They began to join the Republican Party because Barry Goldwater had argued that mandatory desegregation of public facilities was unconstitutional. Republicans wanted to exploit the divisions between Democrats, Southern Democrats who were in favor of segregation, and Northern Democrats who were in favor of integration by giving segregationists a new home in the Republican Party. Now you'll notice as you look at the illustration here that in 1964 there was just the beginning of the southern states turning to be solidly Republican. And then in 1968 there's that weird yellow bit, and that is because the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, was running for president on a segregationist ticket. The only time that happened in American history. Anyway, after 1968, the Republicans toned down their rhetoric on race. Most white Americans had embraced token integration and rejected ideologies of very right-wing groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Overt bigotry had become unattractive, and so Republicans focused on issues of social conservatism to forward their agenda instead of focusing overtly on race. When Nixon used the phrase law and order, that is what he meant. He was taking advantage of white Americans' anxieties about urban riots, about the Black Panthers and their possession of guns, and about anti-war protests. All right, so law and order historically a kind of a dog whistle against people living in urban areas. Nixon was elected to the presidency in 1968 and of course was inaugurated in early 1969. And he focused on a number of policies that he called his Southern strategy. More policies designed to move Southern whites from the segregationist part of the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. So, for example, he appointed conservatives to the heads of departments that historically were in charge of human support in various ways, like commerce, health, education, welfare, and the Office of Economic Opportunity. Nixon's head of the Office of Economic Opportunity immediately reversed several initiatives in favor of affirmative action. Now, affirmative action was something that was part of the Office of Equal Opportunity set up under Lyndon Johnson. And the point was to compensate for decades and decades of discrimination against African Americans by providing incentives for the hiring of minority and women candidates. So that was affirmative action. The new Office of Economic Opportunity chief that Nixon chose shut 10 regional offices, and scores of Johnson's anti-poverty programs were shut down. Nixon also opposed school desegregation guidelines that would have terminated federal funding to segregated schools. But the Supreme Court blocked Nixon's agenda by voting unanimously in favor of a new way to do desegregation of schools, which was to bus students from their homes to schools that needed more students of whatever diverse ethnicity or race in order to integrate them. The Supreme Court said busing was okay. Nixon was a huge opponent of busing, and this jived with what a lot of white Northern families wanted. They didn't want their students to be bused across town, maybe 45 minutes, to integrate a school that was primarily a minority school. Nixon also began the process of moving the federal judicial system to the right with his appointments. He gave the FBI permission to target and destroy the Black Panthers and other Black nationalist organizations. Despite the fact that poverty was the central issue, the Nixon administration singled out inner-city Black male youth as culprits of urban problems, while at the same time withdrawing social service funds, eliminating poverty agencies, and not addressing fundamental structural problems. So instead of actually funneling money into anti-poverty programs, social service programs, Nixon devised a long-range plan to increase policing, a 10-year long-range master plan for the construction of new prisons, and a lot of funding of the police. Nixon supporters aggressively attacked affirmative action. The post-industrial downturn was well underway by the 1970s, and this inspired white Americans to reject and resent the idea that private industries should make efforts to retain Black employees. High unemployment rates, high inflation, and stagnant economic growth were collectively termed stagflation in the 1970s, and these created intense competition in the job market. Even those who had supported the civil rights movement opposed special college and professional admissions programs designed to increase minorities and women's enrollment. They called these things quota systems and argued that these quota systems, quote unquote, placed unqualified people in positions that belonged to more qualified candidates. They championed the idea that job placement and college admission should be determined by merit alone. African Americans and women continued to point out that discrimination in the workplace and in educational settings undermined their ability to achieve the American dream. But increasingly, a group of conservative Republicans calling themselves the New Right responded by arguing that compensatory measures for discrimination were un-American, that they were squelching equal opportunity, that they were depriving individuals of due process of law. They were opposed, of course, to any thought of affirmative action as reparations for slavery, or that there should be a monetary set of reparations for slavery. They called anti-poverty programs handouts and insisted that fairness was only achieved when colorblind criteria were used as the basis for job hiring, college and professional school admissions, and the distribution of government contracts. Conservatives also claimed that they were the victims of, quote, reverse discrimination, unquote, and adopted the rationale used to create affirmative action programs in order to undermine affirmative action. They complained that America was supposed to be the land of opportunity for everyone and that giving some Americans an advantage was unfair. Sort of the paradigm case of this whole thing was the Bakke case, Regents of the University of California versus Bakke. This was decided in 1978. Alan Bakke was a 35-year-old white man who had twice applied for admission to the medical school at the University of California, Davis. He was rejected twice, and he noticed that the school had reserved 16 places in each entering class of 100 people for, quote, qualified minorities as part of the affirmative action program in an effort to redress long-standing unfair minority exclusions from the medical profession. Bakke's qualifications, including his college GPA and test scores, exceeded those of any of the minority students admitted in the 2 years Bakke's applications were rejected, and he argued, first in the California courts and then in the Supreme Court, that he was excluded from admission solely on the basis of race. There was an 8-1 decision in the Supreme Court in favor of Bakke. He had to be admitted to the medical school. But what the justices also decided was that some use of taking into consideration racial and ethnic background and also socioeconomic sort of challenges of students was important in admissions to universities and graduate schools because there was a value to diversity, and all students lost out if there was no diversity in education. Despite the fact that anti-affirmative action arguments were well established before Ronald Reagan took office in 1980, Reagan's presidency furthered efforts to undermine anti-poverty funding, federal jobs programs, and court challenges. Reagan actually declared that he was running for president at a county fair in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And Philadelphia is the small town where 3 civil rights workers were murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in 1964, and their bodies only discovered later. So this was not only a signal, a symbol, but it was kind of a crappy symbol. Reagan declared, "I believe in states' rights," and he argued that discrimination was a myth. His sentiments about racial discrimination echoed those of his favorite conservative theorist, George Gilder. And Gilder said, look, if racism has ever existed in America, it has already been abolished. And he argued that the only discrimination that was happening in America involved discrimination in favor of black people. Gilder called this new American supposed discrimination a, quote, racial spoils system. All right, so Reagan comes into office at a time of new right dominance in the Republican Party, restates his commitment to anti-civil rights. He also expanded this to the economic realm by attacking welfare recipients. Now, the majority of women on welfare in the United States in 1981, when Reagan was inaugurated, were white. But by the 1960s, the stereotype in people's minds was that welfare recipients were African American women who were lazy, immoral, and irresponsible. Reagan called such recipients of government assistance, quote, welfare queens, claiming they were sexually promiscuous, irresponsible, parasitic, living comfortably and extravagantly on taxpayers' money. During Reagan's presidency, 10% of welfare recipients were removed from the program's rolls, and an additional 300,000 families had their welfare assistance reduced. Reagan also declared a war on drugs in 1982, passing punitive anti-drug laws which imprisoned many first-time offenders and disproportionately affected African Americans. Under the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, the Justice Department and Department of Defense joined forces so that the Navy, Coast Guard, Air Force, and Army could provide manpower to help apprehend drug offenders. The act mandated 5 years in prison for any crime committed with a firearm. And it also gave kind of a perverse incentive to police departments by allowing local police departments to keep 90% of the property and cash that they seized from drug dealers. Ronald Reagan's war on drugs federalized state laws, like the 1973 Rockefeller drug laws in New York, that created mandatory sentences of 15 years to life for the possession of just 4 ounces of a narcotic, roughly the same sentence that you'd get for second-degree murder. On the surface, Reagan's new drug policies appeared to be race neutral, but they were not applied in a race neutral fashion. In 1985, a new drug epidemic swept through urban areas. This was crack cocaine that had been refined into a much cheaper, smokable rock form, and it, instead of costing hundreds of dollars for powder cocaine, which was how much it cost, it would only cost you, let's say, $10 or something for a rock of crack. When people were brought to court and tried for possession of crack cocaine, their sentences were much more times more severe than people who were arrested for the possession of powder cocaine, even though it was the same substance. And so a disproportionate number of first-time African American drug offenders were incarcerated. The nation was bombarded at this point with images and stories not only of joblessness, low-performing schools, deficient healthcare facilities, and decrepit housing, but Americans were also led to believe, well, white Americans anyway, that drug use had made slums of America's inner cities. Not that deindustrialization or globalization or unemployment or lack of funding for public schools had done this to urban areas. Also, there was a kind of a moral panic about so-called crack babies who were born drug addicted, although it turns out in retrospect that that really was not a thing. Anyway, Reagan also appointed as many conservative federal judges as he could and shifted the Supreme Court of the United States to the right. He appointed 368 district and appeals court judges, almost half of the judges on the federal courts. Of that number, only 24 were minorities. There were 29 women. The rest of Reagan's court appointees were white males who were mostly conservative. Reagan named the first woman, Sandra Day O'Connor, to the Supreme Court in 1981, but she was a conservative. And he also promoted arch-conservative William Rehnquist to Chief Justice and appointed Antonin Scalia to fill Rehnquist's seat. Several black feminist groups were established during the late 1960s and early 1970s, including the National Welfare Rights Organization that I already mentioned in a previous lecture, the National Black Feminist Organization, the National Alliance of Black Feminists, the Combahee River Collective, and Black Women Organized for Action. Each of these organizations owed its existence to black women's exclusion from leadership roles in the civil rights and black power movements. Black feminists argued that black women experienced a unique gender and base race oppression. They used the phrase double jeopardy to describe the hardships that came from being black and female in a country that is both racist and sexist. Black women took the lead in efforts to secure quality education for black children. Black children's achievement levels were consistently lower than white children's. Black dropout rates were higher, black schools were dilapidated, textbooks were out of date, and teachers presented with the difficult task of managing classes with as many as 40 or 50 students were more concerned with making sure there was order in the classroom, that nobody was screaming, getting out of their chairs, than they were with teaching. In large cities such as Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Denver, and in smaller cities like Plainfield, New Jersey, and Stamford, Connecticut, black mothers organized to improve the quality of their children's education. They fought for integration via busing because they understood that white schools were well-funded, better equipped, and often underpopulated compared with overcrowded minority schools. In 1974, Boston erupted in violence after a judge ordered a mandatory busing system to desegregate schools. Angry mobs in South Boston shut down high schools, threw stones and bricks at school buses, and besieged city council meetings to protest forced integration. On a wider scale, African Americans continued to seek control over their communities by pursuing political office. Starting in 1971, the Congressional Black Caucus helped black candidates get elected. Shirley Chisholm, who you see here, the only black woman in Congress, founded the organization along with 12 black congressmen. The Congressional Black Caucus supported black candidates in local elections, lobbied for reforms in job training, health care, welfare, and social service programs, and attempted to fashion a national strategy to increase black political power. In 1970, there were only 1,469 black elected officials in the U.S. By 2006, this number had increased sixfold to 9,040. African Americans also made significant gains in local politics. In 1970, there were only 2 African American mayors of big cities. By 2001, there were 47 in cities with populations larger than 50,000, and only about half of those cities had black majorities. The largest annual percentage increase of black elected officials between 1969 and the year 2000 occurred in 1971, and that underscores for you the impact of the Black freedom movement, that is, black power, black empowerment, black is beautiful, on black political participation. Obviously, we are still in the midst of a national struggle over the question of political participation, who should have the right to vote, how easy it should be for people to vote. Stacey Abrams is an example of a modern political figure who really flipped Georgia in 2020 by, after she lost the Georgia governor's race, going around voter restrictions that had been put in by Republicans in her state by just mass registering more voters, getting more people involved in the political process. These are people who have a right to vote, but who had not been perhaps interested in voting before. As a result of that, we saw 2 Senate seats go from red to blue in Georgia in the year 2020. African Americans also continued to have an impact on presidential elections. You may be familiar with John Lewis. He was a strong connection between the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the movement against voter suppression in 2020. He didn't run for national office, but he's worth mentioning. The Reverend Jesse Jackson was another person who was active in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. He was right near Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Jackson, became a serious presidential contender in 1988. He won 7 primaries and 4 caucuses. He appealed to rural farmers, black and white urban workers, and environmentalists with a populist message that condemned tax breaks given to big business and Reagan policies that really shifted the tax burden from the wealthy to the poor. And then, of course, Barack Obama, who I will say more about in a moment, became our nation's first African American president in 2008. Okay. Before 1950, African Americans in the middle and upper classes lived in and served black communities. As you guys know from previous lectures, they were morticians, they were barbers, they were beauticians, restaurant owners, store owners, doctors, teachers. But unemployment discrimination guaranteed after, 1964, that fewer African Americans would obtain middle and upper class status. In 1963, the Ford Motor Company was asked which of its white-collar jobs were open to African Americans, and the company listed valets, porters, security guards, messengers, barbers, mail clerks, and telephone operators. So there was still segregation going on in hiring. As a result of this, government jobs at all levels, because governments are required not to discriminate, became a major outlet for college-educated African Americans. By 1980, the number of African Americans who occupied professional and managerial roles had increased by a factor of 5. Also, between 1970 and 1980, the number of black college students doubled, increasing from 522,000 to over 1 million. Even though there was a black middle class, their tenuous status was evident in housing trends. In 1968, Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited housing discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The act outlawed the process of blockbusting, steering, redlining, all methods that realtors and banks used to try to keep African Americans confined to neighborhoods that were already primarily minority neighborhoods. At first, the act excluded almost 80% of the nation's housing, but a 1968 Supreme Court ruling ensured that the act applied to all of the nation's housing. So theoretically, the federal government was supposed to desegregate the housing market. Despite new laws, white suburbs remained closed to blacks. Many towns rezoned to keep affordable housing out, guaranteeing that only the very wealthy could move in. And the Supreme Court aided white suburbs in excluding African Americans and poor people. By the year 2000, 1/3 of all African Americans lived in the suburbs. However, the majority of African Americans, even black suburbanites, lived in all black neighborhoods. By 1998, the class differences among black Americans were stark and clear. A percentage of African Americans had advanced into the middle and upper classes, while the rest of America's black people lived in poverty. The term underclass was used to describe those who were impoverished, earned a low income, or were unemployed, and commentators pointed at what they called a culture of poverty. So this is a way pretty much to blame poverty on generational factors or cultural practices or lack of marriage in the black community or female-headed households. African Americans suffered the highest rate of poverty in the nation. More than 1/3 of all African Americans lived in poverty, and in the 1990s, unemployment rates for young black males reached 50%. The firearm homicide rate for black males was 2 to 4 times higher than for any other socioeconomic group, accounting for 42% of all young black male deaths. All right, so if you were an African American man around the turn of the 21st century, you had a very high probability of ending up dead through gun violence or being unemployed. African Americans made up only 11.4% of the total U.S. population, but black men represented nearly 31% of all inmates in America's prisons. By 1990, more black males between the ages of 18 and 22 were in jail than were in college. Consequently, 2/3 of black women of marriageable age were unmarried. By 1990, half of all African American children lived in single-parent, female-headed households, and almost 50% of these children were born into poverty. Now, drug use did play some role in this, the daunting statistics of black working class life. But we must point to the fact that unemployment was so high that branching out into the drug trade was one of the only means of economic advancement in some areas. The drug trade in black communities increased black-on-black crime. Gang violence accompanied the competition for drug markets. When law-abiding black citizens asked the government to wipe out drug corners, crack houses, gangs, and gun violence, yes, they got tougher no-tolerance laws, but they also got more aggressive policing. Police stopped, searched, and verbally abused law-abiding along with criminals. The number of African Americans incarcerated for drug offenses skyrocketed from 40,900 people in 1980 to 452,964 in 2017. And I must point this out. African Americans and whites, and probably other minorities as well, use drugs at the same rate, but African Americans are still 3.6 times more likely to be incarcerated for similar drug offenses than are white Americans. 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses are either black or Hispanic. So-called zero-tolerance measures have a devastating effect on African Americans. One scholar has called the mass incarceration of African Americans, quote, the new Jim Crow, because like legal segregation, it is a system of racialized social control that preserves the racial hierarchy and, quote, locks a huge percentage of the African American community out of mainstream society and the economy. It should be noted that when people are jailed for felony crimes, even if it's a ridiculous felony crime like the possession of marijuana, now legalized in so many states, they lose out in any number of ways. First of all, it's very difficult to get a job after you are released, having served time for a felony conviction. You get your voting rights taken away from you in some states. And also, you don't get access to the same skills, the same work history in prison as you would had you not been in prison. So there is this long tail of quality of life issues that impacts people who were often arrested for pretty petty drug crimes. The term carceral state is used to describe the combination of police surveillance, restrictive penalties, and measures designed to control black people's behavior. Just to tell you about a couple of miscarriages of justice that you may not be familiar with. In 1989, 5 black youths, so black teenagers, were arrested in Central Park for the rape of a jogger who became known as the Central Park Jogger. They were jailed. They were, the press made a huge deal out of how reprehensible and insane and culturally, culturally bestial their behavior was. And then in 2002, a serial rapist confessed to the crime, and it was revealed that law enforcement had had reason to suspect him at the time, but didn't test his DNA until years later. So this was a way in which it was assumed that these black teenagers in Central Park had participated in a heinous crime and they had had nothing to do with it. And yet, at the time that they were arrested, Donald Trump, at that point just the head of the Trump organization, called for the death penalty for these youths, and he didn't walk that back even after they had been found to be innocent of that crime. Finally, even natural disasters are experienced differently by Black and white Americans. In 2005, a F5 hurricane, Hurricane Katrina, struck the Gulf Coast. Now, New Orleans is under sea level. I mean, it's lower than sea level, and so it was only protected by a series of levees and pumps. They failed. The Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain flooded New Orleans' streets. More than 85% of New Orleans was immersed in water that was, in some places, 20 feet deep. Despite the fact that both the African-American mayor of New Orleans, Ray Nagin, and white Louisiana Governor Kathleen Blanco issued evacuation orders, there was no way for many people to actually leave the city. They didn't have cars, buses were not arranged for. 2,000 people at least lost their lives. Many more required rescue from first responders. New Orleans residents were stranded on roofs or in attics for days without food, clean water, or police protection. Most of those who suffered were poor and Black. Nearly a year and a half after the tragedy, Black neighborhoods like New Orleans' 9th Ward remained devastated. Census estimates from 2014 show that compared to the year 2000, about 100,000 fewer African Americans and 9,000 fewer whites lived in New Orleans. So there was a huge demographic shift as a result of the disaster and the destruction that it left behind. It's interesting that many African Americans moved a short distance from New Orleans to Houston, and that the number of Hispanic residents of New Orleans has increased between 2005 and now. So the city is still quite diverse, but in different ways. We've talked before about African Americans and culture, about music and sports. And during this later period, beginning in the 1970s in New York City, rap music and hip hop emerged. Rap music and hip hop culture originated on the streets of Harlem and the South Bronx. There were competitions between lyricists who exchanged rhymes, DJs, and dancers who performed breakdance routines at block parties, recreation centers, and on basketball courts. Hip-hop and rap culture emerged as important mediums through which Black youth could analyze and interpret the violence and poverty of their neighborhoods. Young rappers used their lyrics to critique violence, poverty, police surveillance, drug addiction, Black-on-Black crime, and unemployment. But a lot of people, Black and white, were uncomfortable about the genre due to the use of graphic sexual and violent language, lyrics that denigrated women, lyrics that glorified gangsters, and the constant use of various iterations of the N-word. The Black middle class in particular was kind of worked up about this. Stage competitions between rappers, though, replaced gang rivalries in some areas, so that was quite good. It not only allowed young African Americans to express and release frustration, but the industry also could function as an additional escape route out of poverty. Artists like Notorious B.I.G. and Tupac Shakur became millionaires, although, a lot of rap stars' careers have ended and their lives have ended, too soon through violence. And Black-owned record labels like Death Row Records became equally successful. All right, I'm going to end by talking about the civil rights movement today. So, of course, Obama was elected in 2008. And people talked at the time about, how we must be in a post-racial society if a black president can be elected. Well, racism was evident in the reaction to Obama's election. You may remember or not be old enough to remember birtherist conspiracy theories that tried to claim Obama was not a natural-born citizen or that he was not a Christian. There were calls for him to show his birth certificate, and then some Republican politicians didn't believe that was his birth certificate. All right, so the whole birtherist issue was one part of the emergence of racism. Another part followed in the wake of the 2012 murder of Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old black teenager in Sanford, Florida. Martin was on his way home from buying Skittles and iced tea. He was wearing a hoodie. He was shot and killed by a neighborhood watch volunteer, George Zimmerman. Zimmerman was not arrested for killing the teenager, even though Martin wasn't doing anything illegal. Florida has these laws called stand your ground laws, whereby if somebody thinks that they are in fear for their life, they are allowed to shoot first. They're allowed to use a deadly weapon. Critics of the police argued that Trayvon Martin was the victim of racial profiling and would be alive today if he were white. When reporters asked Obama about the case, he responded, quote, "When I think about this boy, I think about my own kids, and I think every parent in America should be able to understand why it is absolutely imperative that we investigate every aspect of this and that everybody pulls together to figure out exactly how this tragedy happened. If I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon, and I think his parents are right to expect that all of us as Americans are going to take this with the seriousness it deserves and that we're going to get to the bottom of exactly what happened." And, the Tea Party people were out of control about the fact that Obama said Trayvon Martin would look like his son if he had a son, and accused Obama of taking sides. Also, during Obama's administration, it should be noted that there were lots of police shootings of African Americans. Many urban police departments have adopted a quote-unquote broken windows policing strategy, which holds that if minor crimes are held to a minimum, then major crimes are unlikely to occur. This strategy manifested itself in stop and frisk programs, wherein citizens are stopped and patted down for weapons and other contraband on pretty much any pretext. This has led to a lot of confrontations between the police and African Americans who are unarmed, minding their own business, whatever. 18-year-old Michael Brown was killed in August 2014 by Darren Wilson, a white police officer in Ferguson, Missouri. And protests against this killing of Michael Brown sparked a nationwide movement against police brutality. Some African American women came up with the internet hashtag BlackLivesMatter, compelling the nation to take a candid look at the number of African Americans murdered by police and the socioeconomic factors hidden behind the numbers. And the Black Lives Matter movement organizers pointed to the fact that there was absolutely no equality in the way that police treated black and white individuals. To give you one example, Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old boy playing with a toy gun in Cleveland, Ohio, was killed by Timothy Lohman, a 26-year-old white police officer, within like 2 seconds of Lohman pulling up on Tamir Rice in a park. He was 12. He was a boy. He was playing with a toy gun. Meanwhile, white racially motivated mass shooters like Dylan Roof, who killed 9 people in a black church in South Carolina in 2015, and Patrick Cruzius, who killed 23 people in the El Paso Walmart in 2019, were taken into custody without being shot by the police. So, Tamir Rice does nothing wrong. He's killed on sight. Dylan Roof kills 9 people, gets bought Burger King. Patrick Crusius gets arrested after being seen by many, many eyewitnesses shooting 23 people, and as of the date of the recording of this lecture, has not yet even had a trial. The murder of George Floyd on camera by police officer Derek Chauvin was really the first major case to end in the conviction of a police officer, and only after massive protests across the U.S. in 2020. Now, Chauvin's conviction might show that the tide is turning, or it might not. I'm not a fortune teller. But Black Lives Matter protests are clearly a part of the larger civil rights movement that we've been studying in this class. Similarly, the Poor People's Campaign, which was founded by Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, was revived in 2018 by Reverend William Barber, and it is committed to many of the same principles as the campaign of the 1960s. Attention to issues of poverty and discrimination and voter suppression, not just in the Black community, but in Indigenous and Hispanic communities as well. If I had made up this class in 2008, I might have a happier story to tell you. But we continue to be in the middle of a civil rights movement. We continue to be a nation that has not grappled at all, really, with the long legacy of racism and discrimination. And that's where we are. And I would love to hear your thoughts about all this in the discussion. See you in the comments.